Welcome to today's event, Overcoming Barriers to U.S.-South Korea Shipbuilding Cooperation. My name is Ellen Kim, Director of Academic Programs here at KIEP, and thanks very much for joining us today. Shipbuilding cooperation has become a buzzword in U.S.-Korea relations as the United States seeks to modernize its shipbuilding industry to meet growing commercial and defense demands. South Korea is emerging as a vital partner. With Hanwha's acquisition of Philly Shipyards last year both South Korea and the United States are now rallying behind the Make American Shipbuilding Great Again MASGA initiative. In addition, the recent discussion between President Trump and President Lee Jae-myung regarding a potential nuclear-powered submarine adds a new dimension to this growing shipbuilding partnership. That said, challenges still remain. Today, we are joined by two leading experts who will help us unpack these issues and offer some insights and policy recommendations. Before I introduce our speakers, I would just note that today's event marks the final Korea policy event of this year, and the research analysis presented by our speakers will be featured in the upcoming issue, which will be out in December and available on our website. Let me introduce our speakers, starting from Lydia. Dr. Lydia Shanklin-Roll is an anthropologist adjunct faculty for Southern New Hampshire University. From 2024 to 2025, she was an American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. State Department. She served as an economic officer in the Office of Korean and Mongolian Affairs, where her portfolio includes shipbuilding. And she was previously an AAAS fellow at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where she worked on digital education initiative in the Gambia. Prior to our PhD, Dr. Roll taught English in South Korea and Ankara, Turkey. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Turkey. Next is Dr. James Kim, who is a director of the career program at the Henry Stimson Center. Congratulations for your new appointment. And he is currently also a lecturer at the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. Dr. Kim also previously served as a director of public opinion here at KIEP and spent over a decade at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies in Seoul and Washington. He also held a number of academic appointments at various places, including Cooper Union, New York University, Hunter College of City University of New York. Dr. Kim's research examines the intersection of the political economy, foreign policy, East Asian security, and Korean politics and democracy. Dr. Kim holds a PhD in political science from Columbia University and MS and BS with honors degrees in industrial and labor relations from Cornell University. Thank you very much for coming, James and Lydia, for joining us today. I'm very glad to have you both because you guys have been following this issue very closely. Shipbuilding is a really new frontier area in U.S.-ROK cooperation. So I want to start with a very basic question, though, which is, why is South Korea regarded as an ideal partner in the U.S. shipbuilding industry? Is this mainly because South Korea is the second largest shipbuilding country in the world, or are there some other reasons that South Korea is most best positioned to address U.S. shipbuilding needs? Floor is yours. Whichever wants to go first.
Sure, I can start. So I see sort of three reasons that South Korea might be best positioned to help the U.S. Certainly capacity is one of those reasons, and being the second largest shipbuilding country globally is an indicator of that capacity, so that would be number one. Second, South Korea is known for innovative design and approaches to shipbuilding, which I think means that it is well positioned to help U.S. shipyards modernize. There's a certain sort of knowledge base there that we could draw from in collaboration. And then third is very strong demonstrated willingness to help. Certainly both the Korean government and Korean shipbuilders are very excited about this prospect and are clearly willing allies in rebuilding U.S. shipbuilding, but I'll let you expand.
Thanks, Ellen, for inviting us. And when you first commissioned this paper, I thought, I just wanted to kind of point out that this is a project that I've been working on relatively recently, but the insight that I bring to the table is from the Korean side. and the capacity from the Korean corporate side in terms of the shipbuilders there, what, if anything, they can do to help American shipbuilding. Lydia, I thought, would be a really fantastic person to be working with, because she was there up until 2 months ago working on these issues. So she brings a perspective that I do not have, which is an inside perspective, which I thought would be very good for this. And I think that the project was a fun one. You know, getting to your question, I think Lydia kind of pointed out all three. Obviously, capacity is very important, but it's also the type of capacity, right? The type of ships that the Koreans are really good at building. And in our paper, one of the things that we try to do is introduce data to give folks a picture of, you know, the on-the-ground facts about what the Koreans are offering, what the state of the shipbuilding industry is in the US, so that the readers can judge for themselves on what the problem is. I mean, we obviously have an opinion about this, but if you take a look at the Korean portfolio, and these are the three largest shipbuilders, and their order book, you know, ranges from 130 ships, 30 ships on order, to all the way up to 150, 160 ships. But a lot of that is, you know, focused on these high-end ships, in particular the LNG carriers, which they're very good at, and which United States does not have a lot of. So we only have, last time I checked, was one LNG carrier. And so, and it's not even a big one. And so the ability for the Korean shipbuilders to bring that technical knowledge, not only to the United States, but also to be able to offer that in Korea as well. We thought it's also very important to point out that they're not competing on the low end with, even though they can build these, you know, container ships and low-end ships, they're not competing on that side with the Chinese. So put aside, let's say that the Korean shipbuilder is just really, really good at producing ships that are very cheap and quickly, but they're all low-end ships, and they're not providing this spectrum here. I think this is a very big plus for the U.S. They want a one-stop shop, a shop that is able to provide the know-hows and the technical ability and the capacity to build the most complex commercial ships, and also to some extent deliver on military side with the naval. This is the group that can do it. And you know, I think Lydia pointed out in our paper, as we were writing this, that Korea is not the only country to be investing in the United States. But this portfolio is very unique to Korea, and I think that's something to be said. Secondly, you know, we're an ally, and it's also one of two countries in the region where you have a U.S. naval ship base in Japan, Yokosuka, that's very close to Korea. So in many regards, I think this is, you know, it's a big plus if there's a way that we can cooperate in some ways, whether that be to invest in the United States or figure out how to expand the maintenance and repair operations in theater, should there be contingency need for those things. I think Korea is ready to kick in, and as Lydia pointed out, very eager, right? I mean, talk about putting your money where your mouth is. $100 million to purchase that Philly Shipyard, additional $100 million that they've committed already, and then an extra $5 billion that they've kind of talked about in terms of how that's going to get rolled out, and then on top of all of that, the recent the trade deal that was announced on tariffs. So you know, I think that you've got a player here that's not like Japan. Japan can also do this, though not at the rate that Koreans can do it, but Koreans are already in it. And so the question really is, you know, how do you push this process forward in a way that's beneficial for both countries?
What are the key challenges facing the U.S.-Korea Shipbuilding Corporation right now? You know, before Hanwha's purchase of Philly Shipyard in 2024, things were pretty pessimistic as far as I remember, but suddenly things have changed dramatically. But you know, part of the reason why people were pessimistic was that there was a lot of legal challenges here, legal barriers Jones Act and all that, but what are the key challenges you see from your point of view right now?
You want me to take that first? Sure. Okay, so maybe you want to be mindful of the government's position on this. I think because a colleague is here who's written quite extensively about this issue on the regulatory side with respect to commercial shipbuilding, Colin Graybell at Cato. I don't need to say much about that issue. I think that there can be many things that can be said about that issue, and if you read our paper, we point out what some of these regulatory barriers are, the restrictions placed on commercial ships purchased in the United States need to be built here, need to be built by Americans, it needs to be crewed by Americans to service the ships in continental and also United States, right? So it's on the commercial side, and then you've got on the military side with naval ships and coast guards, right? Title 10, Title 14. Which we outlined. All of these have some waiver clauses in there built in where the president can step in during times of emergency and Congress can allow him to sort of work around these regulations, but these regulations are prevent foreign purchases of ships for use within United States. And so foreign purchases of these ships for use within the United States and also its territories are somewhat limited. What that means is for the shipping companies and the demand, where that demand is going to come from, it is an issue. It's one way that Congress has tried to get around this issue is by now proposing at the committee level the Ships for America Act. And essentially, that particular legislative bill, if it's passed, would allow for a strategic commercial fleet of up to about 250 additional. And with what we've got right now, Congress keeps saying 80. Some people say 90. So let's say round it off, 80 to 90 somewhere within that range, to service all of the United States, right? So what 250 would mean would be, doubling, nearly tripling, right? That number within 10 years. So if that legislation gets passed, then you all of a sudden have this demand generation, and the shipyards now have something to do. Which means that the Philly Shipyard, which is largely outfitted for commercial shipbuilding purposes, would be called into action along with several others all around the country, right? So I think that that's probably the most important thing in terms of where demand is going to come from other than there. Without these restrictive regulations lifted, I think it's going to be tough, right? And so you gotta hope that demand generation is there. That's on the commercial side. And then on the military side, obviously, we've got budgeting and appropriations with DoD spending and also on Coast Guard on spending. And that's, that's an issue that Congress is dealing with on a day-to-day basis. That's what the Secretary of Navy is doing on probably more than half of his time is devoted to procurement-related issues and acquisition. So I think that you got those two sets of factors driving the market here, and the regulatory restrictions obviously one of the important factors. Now we point out there are other issues having to do with shipbuilding in the U.S., but since you asked about regulations, I'll stop there.
What about other challenges you see? You've been looking at this issue, so I'm sure you have other challenges that you think need to be addressed.
Yeah, so I would just add, in addition to the regulatory issues that James sort of summarized pretty well, there are workforce issues that we address in the paper, both recruitment and retention and training. So that's one of the big issues. And then also there are supply chain concerns that are some of that's tied into the regulatory issues and some of it's just a little broader than that. But I would say that those are sort of the main challenges across the board.
I think, on that point, on the labor issue, as Lydia pointed out, and you can read our paper and get a sense of where the data is. This is essentially the state of the sector when it comes to the labor force in this sector. You could see a precipitous decline since 1980. We've never recovered at the level that we needed to. I mean, you see there after the financial crisis, there was a huge dip, after 2009, and we've clawed some of that gain, some of that loss back. But again, just last week, I think Huntington Ingalls, a few miles downstate on Newport News, they laid off over 100 workers. So it's difficult. The other thing also that Lydia pointed out was this issue with turnovers and retention, right? As in general, for the entry-level workers in this sector, and this is the Department of Defense or Department of War testifying, a representative from the Navy testifying in the Senate. Essentially, we quoted him as saying, we got a problem with retention, turnover at 50%. Overall, our economy is at about 10%. Some shipyards that we quoted are having, higher percentage issues, particularly in Philly, that was reported. So the question here is, aside from training, which everybody's focusing on in order to bring the workforce up to date to be able to build these ships, who's dealing with this issue on retention? Congress keeps coming back to the issue of wages and compensation, but you and I, all of us, we all work, but yes, pay is important, but there's some other consideration other than pay that would determine whether or not we would seek this job here or similar job elsewhere, right? Or seek completely different job that requires our skill in a better place, right? And this has to do with standard of living, quality of life, quality of work, and that requires a discussion that goes beyond simply how much you pay these workers. And on the pay differentials, even there, it's not that large. So you got a lot of problems. So you got the wage gap when you're competing with other sectors in the economy. For instance, there was a story that's very famous, right? I think it was an analyst from CBO. He said he visited one of these yards in New England, goes right outside the shipyard. He sees that, shipyard workers are entry level paid $21, $22 an hour. Goes right outside, a few blocks down, a local subway is offering jobs for $18 an hour with full benefits. Safe working place, completely air conditioned. Who wants to work at this kind of job versus that kind of job? Even though the pay differential is about $2, $3 an hour, is that differential really enough to attract workers that would rather go into a service sector, restaurant industry, as opposed to shipyards? So wages definitely important, but it's more than wages is what I'm saying. So what does that mean? The price tag on this when it comes to labor cost, it's jacked up. It's a lot higher than what we think it is. That's number one. That's a huge challenge because it adds into the cost. It feeds into the cost. And then there's the supply chain issue, and we talk about this as well. I mean, when you have This is just the price, a global price of commodities that typically go into shipbuilding. You could see that there's modest growth. In some cases, you might say it's sort of tapering down and consolidating in an iron case, steel. But you look at the US, this is not the same picture, right? You go post-2020, the price is already going up, and largely because of the protectionist controls that are the tariffs, are feeding into this. So when the government thinks about sort of these broader macroeconomic and trade-related policy issues, they do need to think about how this impacts certain kinds of sectors like shipbuilding. This adds into the cost, right? So raw materials is one of the costs. The other is supply chain, which is not as well built out. Everybody keeps talking about the ecosystem for the shipbuilding industry. I just spoke with some folks talking about the icebreaker shipbuilding in Finland yesterday, and this is their exact words, which is, you know, when you think about Finland's shipbuilding industry as a whole, 80% is ecosystem, 20% is the shipyard. If we think about it that way, and I'm not saying that icebreaker shipbuilding is the same as LNG or container shipbuilding, or for that matter, shipbuilding for destroyers or frigates or oilers, we can go on. But if you think about it that way, do we have the supply chain ecosystem here in the United States that's as well built out as it is in Korea? And you know, we have data in there. You look at the big three, anywhere between 1,300 to 2,500, even close to 3,000 suppliers for each of these companies ready to provide supplies, parts, components, labor that are necessary so that the shipyards can respond very quickly to the changing conditions. You know, I don't think we have that here. Part of the reason why the U.S. Is very slow to respond is largely because the demand signals aren't there. So that demand isn't there for these suppliers to be always, you know, operating at the level that the Korean suppliers for that industry is operating. So this is a different ballgame altogether. We just do not have the, how should I say this, the muscle memory behind the industry itself to be able to deliver the way that countries like Korea, in the case of icebreaker like Finland, is able to deliver on those products. So, you know, so we talked about the demand, talked about labor, then we talked about supply chain. Three problems that we pointed out in the paper.
Two follow-up questions, maybe one. What is the price differential between, for labor in the U.S. and South Korean shipbuilding industry? Is there a huge?
So I think, you know, Wall Street Journal just came out with an article recently about the Philly Shipyard of $48,000. And we have, you know, the wage differential worked out in the paper. And, you know, you look at the prices, and obviously it's difficult to compare, right? Because cost of living is different, but it's comparable in terms of average. I mean, Korea is an OECD country. It's an advanced economy. In terms of, I think the Wall Street Journal article said $48,000 for entry level in Philly. It's about there in the Korean shipyards, and they've been increasing their salary over the last 3-4 years because there's just more need for workers, and so in terms of the salary differential. We don't see much. That's another very interesting fact, right? Even though the salary differential isn't there, productivity difference. I mean, I don't need to say it. Part of the reason why we don't have the United States here because it's the x-axis. If we put it in, it would be a line at the bottom. It just wouldn't match up here, right? So just decided not to put it in because it's the x-axis. And so, well, it'll go under the x-axis because the x-axis, the y ends at 5 million tons. So it's got to go below that line, and you know, so it's there's something that goes beyond simply the availability of labor and such, because we do have shipyards that are operational. It's just they're not producing at the rate that the Koreans are, and so this is another strength that the Koreans have to offer.
So that is a good segue to ask about how are the ways that we can actually overcome some of the challenges and barriers that you just mentioned. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like to deal with the labor and supply chain and other demands issues?
Yeah, so what we propose in the paper is obviously we need to address some of the regulatory issues and sort of tied into that is this phased approach that we propose. This is not a new idea. Mike Roberts from Hudson had a two-phase approach in one of his reports that he put out. But based on conversations that I have had over the last year, we think sort of 3 phases might be a little more logical. So the first phase would be sort of immediate, where the U.S. would commit to buy a limited number of very specific ships from Korean shipbuilders who are investing in the United States, so it's tied to that investment piece. These would be non-combatant ships, so things like logistic ships for the Navy perhaps, maybe some container ships for the commercial side, bigger container ships than we build in the United States. So that would sort of be tied together, and that would address sort of 3 things simultaneously, or 2 things. So one, it addresses immediate U.S. need, because we do not have the capacity in the United States, and we can't just flip a switch and have the capacity be there overnight. And I think that needs to be acknowledged in all of these discussions, a little bit more than it sometimes is.
And those ships you're referring to are built in the U.S.?
Built in Korea.
Built in Korea. Okay.
Yeah, so this would require addressing some of those regulatory issues we were talking about earlier. But it would allow us to address immediate U.S. need. It would free up capacity in U.S. shipyards to build more sensitive ships, like destroyers, just as one example. And it would provide immediate ROI for Korean companies that are investing in the United States, thereby potentially encouraging additional investment, right? The second phase would be once capacity in the United States has increased, sort of transitioning to buying parts or components of ships for final assembly in U.S. shipyards. And then the third phase would be once investments and shipyard improvements are complete in the United States, transitioning shipbuilding entirely to U.S. shipyards. So we think that sort of addresses needs and interests on both sides of this equation, while sort of ramping up U.S. shipyard capacity.
So I think Lydia said it really well. This model is not a unique one. Mm-hmm. If you think about the arrangement that the Finns have worked out with the Arctic ice cutters, and 11 ships. By the way, I think there's some important lessons to be learned there for the Koreans on how the Finns proceeded and pushed forward with this. And I'm looking into it, and I think it's very fascinating how the Finns did this. So out of the 11 ships that the Coast Guard will get, 4, based on what we know, MOU is not public, and so we don't know the nitty-gritty details of what and how this is going to get done. But we know that 4 will be built in Finland. And then the remaining 6 or 7, because it's 11, of the remaining 7, 3 gets built by Davies down in Galveston, Texas. And then 4 gets built by, and Davy is a Canadian shipbuilding company that just, is purchasing the shipyard here. And then 4 gets built out in Louisiana by Bollinger. So you have essentially, if you take a look at that, it's a trilateral arrangement that I think is a pickup from the ICE Pact that was signed in 2024, if I'm not mistaken, and started under the Biden administration, which means that Trump 2.0 is carrying through with that model. Though, I mean, it's a very interesting, delicate balance, but it's not a bilateral, even though this was rolled out as a bilateral arrangement, and clearly the ICE Pact is a different kind of an arrangement. They're talking about different number of ships there also than the one that they signed out between Finland and the United States. But the fact that Davy is involved in this, and Davy's also getting involved in Scandinavia as well, suggests to me that there's a lot of coordination going on, which brings other players into this picture, and it's a very interesting one. The Koreans are doing this in their own way, right? So you got 2 different models. You got Hanwha, who's basically come in and they put their money down and they're going in on this. And they're essentially going to make this work for them, whichever way possible. And then you got HD Hyundai, which is engaging in a lot of partnerships with the shipbuilder primes and also with these new companies that are, in this autonomous space, for instance, with Anduril is one example. So at what point is this going to lead to a model like, for Hyundai, like the one that Hanwha has? Or can we think of an arrangement where perhaps this can be discussed even with Japan on a trilateral basis? So this stuff, by the way, wasn't in the paper because the paper is long as it is, I think, and it warrants a different kind of a paper because it's about Finland. So all I wanted to say here is that what Lydia is suggesting is definitely, I think it's an interesting, but it's not a far-fetched idea. It's already being done in some other places. So this is not too radical, and it's one worth thinking about or at least considering. Obviously, addressing the issue of demand generation, very important. Folks would say complete deregulation, some folks would say partial deregulation. We go into the logic of these arguments and think about what they would mean. The political implications of this obviously is difficult. It's not easy, but worth thinking about. I've always asked myself, because this is a cabotage issue, why don't we have similar kind of arrangement that we have with airlines? United flies both Boeing and Airbus, so I couldn't, and that was kind of my, ignorant self, kind of looking into this. As I come into this, okay, yeah, there are some national security implications having to do with, cargoes and so on. So, okay, the argument's out there. I get it. All I'm saying is there's some options to think about when it comes to this issue of demand generation, because you can build all the ships you want. If there's nothing for them to do, doesn't matter how many good shipyards you've got. Demand generation in shipping is very important. I think the last current nominee for the Maritime Administration, essentially that's what he said in the last confirmation hearing. So I thought that's a very important point. Labor, very important. It requires discussions not only with the shipbuilding companies and telling them to just pay these workers more. You gotta get folks at the municipal level and the state level to come together with these companies to say, how are we going to provide the right kind of services for these workers to make this as pleasant and attractive for them as possible? In other words, on housing, on hospitals, on schools. These are very, very important issues that go into our calculus when we decide whether or not we want to work in this company or we don't. And I think that discussion needs to happen. It needs to be all government effort, and the businesses need to be involved in that discussion as well. On supply chain, we would recommend, right, that the federal government, and in particular the administration, think about the fallout and the spillover impact of what a tariff on steel means for this particular industry. And so maybe carve out particular provisions in there that would allow for a phased-in kind of tariff, or allow for certain kinds of waivers on these. If you're really serious about having these ships be built in the United States and at comparable cost, because the cost differential is just too much. This is probably a very important consideration for the administration. So we kind of pieced together several series of recommendations in here as a sort of a menu of options, because we don't really know, at least I didn't know, what would be politically feasible, but it clearly requires, and these are hard decisions.
Since you mentioned about trilateral cooperation, I'll go into that question soon. But before I do that, I'll just add one very, maybe, as an outsider, I'll just ask this question. Since given that there is a labor issue with the, can we see sort of machinization, digitalization can be a way to address some of the issues?
I think certainly that could be a possibility. Yeah.
Automation's actually happening.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's
you go to
happening.
the Korean shipyards, they do use robots and
Yeah, that's what I saw in Hyundai HD. I think they made a partnership with the Palantir or something.
That's right.
So a lot of things are now done in digital. And that could be maybe I see as a way to address some of the issues maybe.
yes, definitely. I think Hyundai Motors, if you were to ask them about their factories, automation is definitely a consideration. The problem with that is there's a political framing of this particular issue, which is about job creation, right? And so I think you know, that's number one. Number two, there are certain limits to how much automation you can do for these structures, right? An aircraft carrier is worth about 8 Eiffel Towers. You know, without having any human beings there, is it possible to completely automate this process? I don't think we've seen that yet. So I think there are certain limitations to applying those things to some of these platforms. But clearly, what kinds of platforms do we need? What kinds of ships? How do we build one large container, as some shipping companies are requesting right now or demanding? Or do we build series of smaller ones? You know, and these are all considerations that we can have for the shippers, as well as, I think, for the Navy. I mean, this is a constant struggle for the Navy. What kind of fleet do we need in order to fight the future wars? And there was a really interesting piece that just came out in Stimson, which talks about the kind of naval ships that we need to have. And it's essentially a container ship with these missiles that are autonomously operated. And it's not a complex vessel like an aircraft carrier or a nuclear submarine. And so I think that discussion is for another time. But you raise an important issue, and yes, I think automation is part of the it's part of the discussion. But in terms of how much automation you can do in this industry, and whether or not that's politically feasible, both of those are considerations to think about.
Sure. So let me move on to the next question, which is, you know, during President Trump's visit to South Korea, actually before South Korea, he went to Japan, and U.S. and Japan actually signed an MOU to expand on shipbuilding capacity by aligning investment, procurement, workforce, and technology initiatives. So this naturally raises a question about the prospect of the U.S. maybe trilateral cooperation on shipbuilding between South Korea, U.S., and Japan. What do you think about that aspect?
I think there are potentially areas for trilateral cooperation. I know it's you have to be a little bit careful about competition because we're talking about industry here, but I think one of the most logical places to potentially start with trilateral discussions would be around workforce issues, because all three countries face unique workforce shortage issues, and so I think it might be beneficial to get us all in the same room to talk about how to address that sort of collective problem.
Yeah, I think the Japanese Shipbuilding Association also announced that they're going to be requesting the Japanese government provide more support or to build capacity. As I recall, and maybe you can chime in here, when this discussion about shipbuilding cooperation with Asian allies were just starting out under Trump and the new shipbuilding office when NSC was still, when it was there. The Japanese were invited to that discussion, but we haven't heard much from them until now. So this, some of this discussion is encouraging in terms of what can be done there. We can split hairs, but when you look at why the Japanese shipbuilders were dragging their feet on the entry, it was about the supply chain and the ecosystem. And so, how do we address that issue? One way to address it is with more investment and incentives. But, part of the reason why I think even some of the Korean shipbuilders are hesitating or really testing the waters here is because to what extent is that support going to be there for them? It hasn't been answered, hasn't been addressed. And so then you have to think about, okay, how do we address that problem? So one way to do this is kind of that second phase model approach that you had. Have certain components or parts be built out in these other facilities. And essentially what we have, and this I just copied off of, the idea that Ron O'Rourke over at CRS had written about on this issue on federated shipbuilding supply chain within the United States. And the idea essentially is that instead of depending on one yard and whatever supply chain they have in that vicinity, think about figuring out how to get a supply chain network that taps into different corners of the country and somehow fast track the supplies and make it more flexible and responsive. And we said, we just added the word the three letters CON to the federated shipbuilding supply chain, and essentially said, why not have a confederated shipbuilding alliance? So that's one way to do it. Now, obviously, this requires some cutouts or exceptions to certain rules. For instance, on the Jones Act with respect to commercial shipping, and then on naval side, these regulatory issues. But again, how do you do that? That's up to Congress. That's up to the industry, and also for the Navy to work out. So you got the administration, you have the industry, and you got Congress that needs to work on this issue somehow and figure a way out forward.
James, I have one last question for you. During President Trump's stay in Korea, he gave approval to South Korea to build a nuclear power submarine, specifically at Philly Shipyard. Now, Korean and U.S. are trying to, find ways to work this out. We'll see what's going to be included in the joint fact sheet, which will be coming out soon. But I want to ask you, what do you see as a potential challenges and risks and opportunities there?
So, if you're doing it in Philly, then this issue, essentially it's a non-issue because that yard is an American yard. Philly, Hanwha U.S. Ocean USA, Hanwha Philly USA is a U.S. shipyard, a shipbuilding company. And so there's none of this issue having to do with access to HEU, highly enriched uranium for the Koreans. So that issue is not a big one. In terms of getting that site approved to build out a nuclear submarine, there are 2 yards that can do this in the United States right now. There are several barriers. Just the certification and licensing alone, I think, is a huge hurdle. Good luck getting it through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Good luck getting the Public Utilities Commission in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to approve this. Having a facility that could handle and store these fissile materials or nuclear materials, radioactive materials, near a major metropolitan area in Philadelphia. Good luck with that. This is just the setup to the next stage, which is then getting a yard that is going to be able to build a submarine. Right now, that is a commercial yard, as we pointed out. Hanwha has committed $5 billion extra to purchase some of the other yards around it, and maybe they can. The question is when, right? So that the amount of capital investment that needs to go into that, and then to be able to get the approval from the U.S. government, have a clear facility where you can do the build out. After you get all these other issues squared away, then you got this issue of labor and supply chain, which we already talked about. And nuclear submarines, very, very unique kind of a vessel. Nuclear, anything, aircraft carrier is another one, very unique. Again, we're citing Ronald O'Rourke's work on this from CRS. 16,000 suppliers. 70% of that is sole source, nowhere else on Earth other than here. Okay, that's on the supply chain. Koreans have never done this before. And I want to, how are they going to do it here? Second, labor. The engineers that are able to build one of these vessels and the components that go in it to be able to miniaturize a reactor and a propulsion system that connects into that. There are only 2 companies that have these skilled workers. Are you going to poach them? How much are you going to pay? And how are you going to get these folks to do this, right? So it's mountain over mountain. I mean, it's possible, yes. The question is how much of a political will, not economic willingness to invest, and then all this other political stuff. I think it's definitely possible, but it's a long road to get there. And then you got to think about the opportunity cost. So while you're setting up for that, what are other ships that you could have built or done where you could have made better margins and gains? What are you giving up? What is the opportunity cost of those capital invested there and resources poured into this that you could have put in other places where the returns are greater? So this is it's a business decision, and I think it's a tough call. But if Hanwha is committed, most certainly, why not? I mean, before before the 60s, 70s, it wasn't as if Korea was a shipbuilding. I mean, they didn't have a shipyard, right? When Chung Ju-young decided to go to Europe and get the capital in order to get the order to build the ships, there was nothing there. And so if anybody can do it, most certainly they can, but there are a lot of barriers here that needs to be overcome. And the question is, how long will it take? I think Hanwha is saying 10 years. Let's see if it gets done in that time. There's another, if you read a lot of the Korean press, they're saying that this is going to get done in Korea. And then you add a lot of those similar kind of problems and put it in the Korean context, where, again, I think, and then on top of that, you got this proliferation-related issues. IAEA comes into play. China, what China thinks about this comes into play. It's not just the United States, and the picture gets a lot more complex. I'm not saying that it's impossible. It's just the willpower and the amount of resources that needs to be thrown to make this work. It's a challenging proposition.
He's awesome. So we have about 12 minutes, so I would like to take some questions from the audience, floor, online audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. And I think that Scott is very wanted to go first, so I'll give your mic to Scott.
Yeah, Scott Snyder, president here at KEI. So the phrase that has not come up that I kind of expected to come up is AUKUS. And the question that I have, because James talked a lot about a Finnish collaborative model, and now we have a US ROK collaborative model, which of these collaborative models is most likely to be effective as a path breaker associated with the challenges of regulatory reform that I think are inherent challenges to any of these projects? So I'd like to hear your views on that, and also the relationship between the AUKUS project and what's being talked about between the US and Korea. Do you think they're going to intersect? Do you think that they're going to end up being sequenced? I mean, there's a whole bunch of interesting issues related to just thinking about delivery of a potential product, a submarine, nuclear submarine. How do you think that the relationship between those two is likely to develop?
Do you want to? You're out of government now. You can talk about this. So we do talk about AUKUS, I think, in our. Do we? I think I mentioned it in the end note. Yes, I did put it in the. Yes, it is in the notes. So thanks for bringing that up, Scott. I think that's a very important point. There is a difference between, I think, the Arctic ice cutter, even though it's for the Coast Guard, and then the nuclear submarine. And I think we kind of finesse this with these modular build-out scenarios, and even for that matter, foreign purchases scenarios. We're not going to be purchasing things like nuclear submarines and nuclear-powered aircraft carriers for the foreign purchases. Essentially, the orders will probably go to those issues where the regulatory barriers and the political risks associated with them are likely to be lower, right? So support vessels, auxiliary ships. Yeah, nuclear submarine is, I think it's a different ball game when you start talking about technology transfer and foreign purchases of that kind of ship versus, let's say, an oiler. And so I think that from a political standpoint, Scott, the bar's a little bit lower for these other kinds of vessels. So Finland picked the right kind of vessels to talk about. As opposed to AUKUS, I think AUKUS, if you take a look, and depends on who you ask, and maybe you can chime in on this as you were following this, and when I look at Pillar 1, the way I read it, 3 Virginia-class, used Virginia-class subs, which the Australians would not have any access to any of the propulsion systems, or for that matter, the reactor. That delivery should occur by sometime in 2030, so sometime between 2030 and 2040. And then after 2040 to 2050, that should then transition to a new sub that would be built using the UK design, not a US design. Okay? And this is between a Five Eyes member, between Australia, UK, and US. South Korea is not a Five Eyes member. Okay, so I think it's important to be mindful of that in terms of the willingness to share technology, how much further you need to go in order to make that work. So that's just a setup. In terms of the ability to deliver on those promises, there are questions. Some people are saying that we're not going to meet that 2040 deadline for the 3 used Virginia sub because we can't replenish quick enough. Which may be a reason why Philly should start building this, but can they do it within the next 5 to 6, 10 years? I don't know, is what I'm saying. So what happens to that program? I don't know. It's up for grabs, and that deal, I think, as I recall, 2021 when it was signed. So it takes 20 years for you to get to a new sub. And it's not even a US design, it's a UK design. Okay, so one possible way that Korea can go here, right? If they could somehow get the United States to agree to all these issues, convince the IAEA and the Chinese that it's going to be okay. This is not going to be a threat to you. It's just about North Korea and nothing else. Instead of going for a US design, why not think about a French low-enriched uranium design? Okay, so that's one possibility if enrichment and reprocessing is on the table. But again, it's a long and winding road to get there. And so what I'm saying is, so one lesson to be learned there, don't be so hell-bent on the US design. Think about other ways to do this. But the question is that design good enough for you? And what use would it have? That's the other question. So I think, overall, AUKUS, interesting idea. If Korea can somehow take part in AUKUS, yes, AUKUS Plus has been talked about. And maybe we can think about some kind of shipbuilding cooperation. But why talk about the most difficult projects? Think about some other ones that are much easier, and maybe lower on the barrier in terms of the political barriers, where you can deliver more immediately, immediate results. That's why I said, take a look at the Finland playbook. That sounds like a really interesting playbook to be looking at if you're thinking about somehow injecting yourself into AUKUS or injecting yourself into trilat arrangement where the ROI returns more immediate, more impactful, and there are long-term implications that's also beneficial for all parties involved.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would just add, when you ask about a model, I think the Finnish model is the model here because it's limited, it's very focused on a specific type of ship. It's a type of ship that is less sensitive. There's no weapon systems on board or any of that. And certainly there is no political will to buy, sophisticated battleships from Korea. So looking at, and it's a recent development that has come about during the Trump administration. So I think it's the most immediate sort of corollary. Mm-hmm.
We have about 3 minutes, so I can take one more question.
Hi, my name is Dong-hyun from Yonhap News Agency. I want to ask your thoughts on how China factors into the U.S.-Korea shipbuilding cooperation. Because if you look at the recent U.S.-China trade deal, the U.S. agreed to suspend measures against the China shipbuilding industry, such as port fees. And it was thought that applying pressure in China would go in tandem with U.S.-Korea cooperation. So is it necessary to keep exerting pressure on the Chinese shipbuilding industry in order for U.S.-Korea cooperation to succeed?
I mean, I think China is certainly always a part of the calculus here. And certainly, some of the reports and other things that have come out already have focused on this is part of why the U.S. should be working with Korea and Japan in addressing these shipbuilding concerns is because they're, China looms large in the Pacific, and there's potential concern that maybe the next conflict that the U.S. gets involved in is related to Taiwan. So I think that's certainly part of it. These recent developments, sort of complicate that a little bit, but I don't know.
Yeah, so it doesn't help because it is about demand. And so, yes, if there's less need to have ships be built in either Korea or the United States, and it's cheaper to build in China, let's say in the case of containers, low end, where the Chinese have comparative advantage, it doesn't help. For the shippers, whether it be in the U.S. or elsewhere, to make those purchases here. Now, here's the other component here. There are certain things, though, certain ships, like I said, that the Korean shipyards do specialize in. For instance, LNG carriers, much better. And so some of this is purely based on economic rationale in terms of your ability to deliver on those fronts. And so it speaks to the whole issue of the demand side of the equation. But having said that, you take a look at last time the Trump administration rolled out any kind of deal with the Chinese. What is the staying power of those deals? I think what that suggests to me is that this injects a factor that not a lot of people are talking about in the shipbuilding industry, which is very, very important: uncertainty. These projects are multi-year projects. Okay, this is not just 1 year, 6 month projects. You're ordering 10 ships over a period of 5, 6, 7, 10 years in the Korean case. Even in the US, these are sometimes, you know, they say 3 years, but then it turns into 6 years. Nobody really knows, but it requires planning. And if you don't have any predictability about that relationship, it creates problems for the industry to plan ahead. And this is very important as you're thinking about coordination, not just for the companies in setting up their businesses, but coordination and how you roll out the incentives to help these companies when you're talking about intergovernment relations, right? So between Korean government and the US government, and also Congress and what the local governments are going to do and to assist. So what this does is, I think it's less about what the port fees mean on a short-term basis, but what the long-term implications of this is for the industry itself. I think it creates an uncertainty, more unpredictable environment. Businesses will have a harder time figuring out how to push ahead, and they may not be willing to make big commitments in the short term and wait to see how this plays out. What that means is look for more delays if they don't have confidence that these measures will stay in place beyond 6 months to a year.
Well, this is a very interesting conversation, and I'm sure that we're going to continue to follow this. So hopefully you can join us, come back to KI again for another very interesting conversation. Anyway, so I'd like to extend our sincere thanks for coming here and sharing your insights. Please join me in a round of applause for our speakers. We look forward to meeting you next year. Thank you very much.